Wonderful and inspiring talks from our three distinguished speakers, and I don't want to intrude more than I need to on the opportunity of the audience to ask questions of them, so I'll just ask one of the three of them. So all medicines come with risk, and if we're to reduce the risk of approved medicines, we need to do science. We need to have access to information that Peggy alluded to, and then we need to take that information and deploy it into practice to reduce that dreadful 1 in 3 number that we heard about in the last talk. So I'd like to ask each of our speakers to comment briefly on how they would like to change, in the best of all possible worlds, their interaction with the private sector to facilitate de-risking science, to facilitate access to the treasure trove of information in the FDA, and to deploy that information in the Medicare and Medicaid populations.
There must be a button here.
There is a button here. Why would it be?
I think it just happened.
Just in the middle, I think.
Well, there's no.
I think if you start talking. Start talking.
It's on. Wherever it is.
Okay, no green light needed here. All right. So good question, Garrett, and I'm sure Peggy and Don will have thoughts about this. Just from the NIH perspective, the notion of de-risking before humans are actually put at some risk obviously is something we could do a better job of. And again, I want to echo what Peggy said about the importance of working in the area of preclinical tox, because the current methods that we use, using animals to assess toxicity, are certainly, while accepted and predictive in a certain way, far from perfect, particularly with liver toxicity. If we have ways, by taking advantage of cell-based toxicology assays, and this Tox21 program that Peggy mentioned, which is a joint effort of FDA, EPA, and NIH, is very much pushing down that road, to be able to develop better surrogates for human toxicity, using human cells, perhaps even human cells derived from individuals of known genotypes because of the ability to use iPS cell technology in this way. Perhaps we could move this forward to the point where we'd have greater confidence before going to a phase 1 trial that we actually have ruled out the major likelihood of trouble. But of course, there's also this question about rare adverse events downstream. And there again, I think the ability, especially with the CTSAs or with the network of HMOs, the HMO Research Network that already has electronic medical records, and that we ought to be able to have early signals of rare adverse events in the post-marketing phase in a fashion that would be extremely useful. And I know FDA is very strongly involved in trying to set up those kinds of networks in order to get evidence that something is not as simple as it may have seemed in the very carefully controlled trials. All of these are great opportunities, I think, for us to improve the likelihood of products being truly safe and truly effective. But it is a challenge to try to bring together all of the interests in the private and the public sector to make that happen. We had a meeting on Thursday and Friday, and Garrett, you were there, and it was a very exciting opportunity with leaders from the pharmaceutical industry, FDA, a bunch of advocates, excuse me, and lots of NIH leadership to talk about the possibility of repurposing and rescuing compounds that along the way have been either approved or not approved for a certain application, and figure out how they might be useful in some other application, particularly a rare disease. And the openness and the goodwill that was in that room, I think, was phenomenal. And it gave me a great deal of optimism that we could tackle things between government agencies and academia and the private sector where we all have something to gain by getting the science right.
All right, well, let's see if I need the green light. Well, Francis has clearly spoken to a lot of the important issues. Let me expand a little bit more from where I sit at FDA. I think it is impossible to completely de-risk either in the development process. I don't think that we will have completely safe drugs or other medical therapeutics in many important arenas that really do matter to improve health. But we need to think about how do we better define those risks, and if we can define the serious risks early on in terms of the R&D process, all the better, so that we don't go down dead-end pathways. But we need to really think about how do we better define the risks and benefits of the products, both as we think about approval, of course, but also as we think about use. And I think that we really need to work together with all kinds of different stakeholders and perspectives to really try to systematize in a more significant way how we think about and apply risks and benefits in different conditions under different circumstances, and recognizing that it's a question of using the best possible science, but also there are other factors, including social values, that ultimately do enter in. But certainly within FDA, we are really trying to much better define the framework for how we assess risks and benefits and apply them to our decision making, and I think that's very, very important. I think the life cycle approach that's increasingly part of our work at FDA and how we think about medical products, both their approval and their ongoing monitoring, is very important as well, because we recognize that there are still unrealized opportunities to better identify risks very early on before promising candidates actually get into patients if they're going to prove to be dangerous, but that many of the safety concerns are not going to emerge during the early R&D process, but when the products are in the marketplace, and now not just thousands of patients might be exposed to them, but millions and over long periods of time in many cases. And so our ability to really use data, working with databases external to FDA, including through electronic health records and the kinds of databases that Don oversees, and through strengthened systems of patient reporting and patient and provider awareness, to be able to really do that post-marketing surveillance and really understand emerging safety signals and be able to respond appropriately to emerging safety signals, and often to continue after an approval to do additional studies if necessary in a targeted way to really understand and define those safety signals. I think we also, this may be getting a little bit far from your the initial intent of your question, but I think it's an area in terms of risk that we have to do a much better job with public education. It's an area that throughout my career in public health I've been struck across a range of different issues and domains of activity that risk assessment and risk communication to the public is just such a challenging task, and that it is perhaps worsened in the modern era with science literacy declining as well. But it's something that if we're going to achieve our goals in terms of translating opportunities in science into real-world products and their appropriate use, we really need to think about as a community.
Just a few quick things. I completely agree with Francis and Peggy said, but a couple other nuances. One is that behind your question is a question that's very crucial to me and our agenda at CMS, and that's alignment. The most common question I get asked by people that visit me from the private sector is, could we align CMS efforts with the private sector? This is a very good example. The pooling of information in conscientious ways would be a form of leverage and alignment that the delivery system would welcome. It drives them crazy when different people are defining different data definitions for the same apparent variable, for example, or using different metrics or setting different goals. So that's very resonant with something that's important to our future. Peggy mentioned CMS data. We have a commitment in HHS and in CMS to more and more transparent use of our data under appropriate privacy restrictions. We're working really hard on that and trying to make data use friendly to everyone, patients, providers of care, and researchers. So that's underway. There's one last point I'll make. It has to do with the safety issue itself. As Peggy said, absolute safety is rarely a possibility. Truly safe systems understand safety to be what James Reason, the great scholar of human error, Reason says that safety is a continually emerging property of a dynamic system. It's not a fixed property. That means safety is a system concept. And in our own work on the science of delivery, I think we need to be more sophisticated about that. For example, anesthesiology is the one discipline, I think, maybe that in nuclear medicine, but anesthesiology operates now at 10 to the minus fifth injuries or less. It's parts per 10,000. The characteristic injury rate in hospital care is, if you're lucky, 10 to the minus 2. So you have a 3 order of magnitude difference. And the way they've done that is anesthesiology 30 years ago, thanks to G. Pierce and a bunch of other really visionary leaders, decided to make safety a system property. And that's not just done by upstream prevention, safe drugs. It's done by early identification and mitigation when you didn't prevent it, and by forms of recovery like Narcan for an overdose, where even once the injury occurred, you still can recover from it. If we think systemically safety can reach the 10 to the minus fifth or better levels.
I'll just ask for probably short answers. I want to get to the audience, but a question: the smoke or mushroom-shaped cloud over academic health centers these days, of course, is that of the installation of electronic health records. And one of the real innovations, obviously, with recent legislation is a huge investment in interoperable national electronic medical records. And it seems to me it's a way for you all three to work together. For doing clinical trials, instead of investing in hugely expensive electronic data capture, the electronic records are there with lots of data to look at the heterogeneity of treatment effect. Obviously, as the Sentinel system displays and other things, there's huge amounts of data that can be collected regarding safety. And also, and this is important, not only because it has to do with transporting that care out to all of our nation, but also right now only 7% of Americans participate in clinical research. And if we had electronic health records that could help capture them, they could be engaged in part of the solution to improving healthcare. I wonder if each of you see this as a potential platform for collaboration.
Well, very quickly, yes, obviously a phenomenal opportunity if we get it right, and that means that whatever falls under this term meaningful use includes the kind of data that will inform research enterprises to glean the answers we're looking for. Of course, it also means we got to get it right as far as the confidentiality and privacy so that the public is comfortable with this, and I fear that in many instances minority voices that are arguing for extreme measures that would get in the way of research may in fact be getting the microphone a bit more often than is good for the public or even what the public wants. So there's a serious interest there in trying to be sure we get that part right. Obviously, observational trials are going to be enormously important. I would say, though, just as a caveat, we will never get away from the need to run randomized control trials if you really want to be sure to take care of all possible biases. And obviously, methodologies that make the most of the new access to observational data are going to be critical, but they will never, I think, completely substitute for the very controlled environment that we need for answering some questions where you really can't have a substitute for that approach.
Well, just to follow up on Francis, I mean, I completely agree that we need, a sort of a whole spectrum of different types of data from the very strictly controlled randomized clinical trials to observational data and the kinds of data mining activities that can potentially be undertaken using information contained in the electronic health records. I mean, we are looking to that as a very important opportunity for us as we build out the Sentinel system that you mentioned for post-marketing surveillance. One can also easily imagine the opportunities to glean important information in other key areas that bear potentially on the work we do at FDA in terms of product assessment and approval. For example, deepening our knowledge about off-label uses so that we could actually apply what's happening in the real world in terms of data analysis that could be used to support the actual approval of use in a given area. And so many other arenas. So I think it's very, very important to the work that we're doing. I'm delighted that the thinking about the broader use of these electronic health records is has been thought about from the get-go in terms of the broader national vision for electronic health records, so that we won't be scrambling after the fact to think about some potential applications that would be very meaningful in domains other than the direct patient care. And I am sorry to hear that it feels like a mushroom cloud hanging over academic medical centers, but I guess I can imagine just on a personal level being so slow to adopt even, BlackBerry technology. I would be, if I was in the clinical world, I think I'd be struggling today.
I agree. I'm with Peggy. I got a free iPod with the last computer I bought, but I don't know how to use it. So I have sympathy with the sociology of if someone would see me after the session, I'd appreciate a little instruction. I'm really optimistic, though. I mean, there's a lot of concern and worry and some resistance around the progress we're making with electronic records, but it's really on track, and I think we'll get through this. And I'll bet you that 5-6 years from now, we'll be looking back and saying we did it, and we've got tremendous stores of knowledge that are now accessible with appropriate recognition of all the stakeholders.
All I can see are lights. There must be
Somebody talk.
there must be people at the microphones. I just can't see where they are.
Maybe they could turn up the house.
Yeah, maybe just turn up the house lights. That would actually help our pupils.
Harry?
There's one, please. I beg.
It's on, no green light. My name's John Farram at the University of Pennsylvania, the Department of Epidemiology, Biostatistics in addition to neurology. One of the issues that struck home with me was a comment that was made about the lack of understanding within the U.S. population about risk versus benefit. And I think one of the issues that comes up there is how to deal with the risks that occur with any kind of medication that we use. Meaning specifically, ideally, when we do a clinical trial, we get efficacy data, but not very much safety data because this trial is small and there needs to be an ongoing monitoring system, as was discussed. At some point, we're going to discover that there's a group of patients who have a risk with a particular drug, and we know that occurs with all drugs. And helping them to understand that risk without throwing the baby out with the bathwater in denying access for the majority of people who don't have risk, I think is going to take a lot of education. And I wondered about the thought that part of the emphasis of the CTSAs is on education of upcoming researchers, but we ought to be focusing also on the education of the population in terms of understanding that their risk of getting into the car and driving to work is 100 times more than their risk of most of the things that go on. And I wondered if you had thoughts about how to extend what we do into that arena. Obviously, CMS could play a role, FDA can play a role, and then NIH can play a role in reaching down much further than scientists who are going to be innovators.
So certainly, you're right, the CTSAs are an interesting place to conduct some pilot experiments of this sort because they do have community outreach as part of their charge, and they're doing it in very creative ways. Obviously, though, the CTSAs are going to touch on a rather small proportion of the overall population, so if we're serious about spreading the kind of educational effort that you talk about, it would need to build upon whatever pilot experiments could be done that demonstrate what actually works, and then try to distribute it and implement it more broadly.
In the interest of time, we'll probably be able to take about one more question or maybe two quite quickly. Go ahead.
Okay. My name is Eve Geneva, and I'm a physician scientist in training. Thank you all for all the wonderful comments. I'd like to switch gears a little bit now, and my question relates to the tightness of the NIH budget at the moment. And during my interactions with the leaders in government and in academia, a possible solution had been raised where one could think of another source of resources being strengthening the relationships between academic centers and industry. However, just looking back at my university and other academic centers, there is a very strong bias among academicians that relates to the influence that industry can have on academia. And how would you suggest to go about removing those biases in the academic world do you think this should be done on the national level through a national initiative, or that every university should have their own local initiatives that would help strengthen their connection with industry and remove all the biases against industry among academicians?
So it's a good question, and I think there are a number of factors that may have played into what you perceive as a bias, and I think that has in fact been true in some instances, although not all. One of the factors, of course, has been the concern about conflict of interest, and that investigators who are collaborating with industry might be seen in some way as having their judgment affected by other than purely scientific issues. And of course, there have been examples that have come to attention that has led NIH to actually take some fairly significant steps to tighten up the conflict of interest guidelines, which are about to arrive on extramural grantees and their institutions in a way that I think will clean up this particular situation to the extent that it should build public confidence, and it should also make it clear that relationships of a scientific sort between academic and industry collaborators can be conducted in a way that is fully disclosed and is fully above reproach. That is an important step, I think, in order to make sure that the scientific opportunities don't get clouded over by concerns about conflict. And so that will help, I think, quite a bit. But there's nothing that will help more than scientific opportunity. And I think, as we've talked about in this panel discussion, and as you will see in many other presentations, I'm sure in the course of this meeting, the opportunity actually for a new paradigm of partnership between academic investigators and industry has never been better. Industry is hungry for those opportunities to grow and develop. As it was pointed out, in fact, the success rate that Peggy mentioned in getting new molecular entities through the pipeline has really been struggling. Yet we have this deluge of new discoveries of possible targets, which academics in many ways are in the best position to try to sift through and figure out which ones are going to be most attractive and most validatable. Industry, on their hand, brings enormous skills to the effort to try to move things along to ultimate approval and clinical application, and academia can't do that alone. So I'm pretty optimistic that the scientific opportunities, which are pretty exceptional right now, will pull these parts of the biomedical research enterprise closely together when the project demands it. Certainly from my perspective as NIH director, we'll do everything we can to make sure that those opportunities are not missed.
There is a microphone over that way.
There is.
Yes. There is a microphone over there.
Yes, hi. I'm a neonatologist and a clinician scientist from Montreal in Canada. I have a question maybe more for Dr. Hamburg. How do you see, or I would like to hear your comments about some therapies that are difficult to regulate, like natural products? And what I'm thinking of more precisely is in neonatology, we had a few randomized clinical trials that have shown marked reduction in mortality, morbidity of necrotizing enterocolitis with probiotics. And probiotics are very difficult to define, I would summarize it. And us as a clinician, we cannot apply those therapies in our NICUs. So how can we, as a researcher community, take this issue on so that ultimately the babies will benefit from this, even if we don't totally understand what's going on?
Well, I think, in fact, your question is one of how can we expand the scientific understanding and the knowledge base about what kinds of therapies work for whom and how, and that needs to be a partnership that includes both the research community, for us, our friends at NIH and others, and of course the regulatory system. As you may or may not know, the regulatory framework for nutritional products, natural products, dietary supplements, and other things is very different in different countries. And as I recall, I think Canada actually has a more rigorous review and oversight of some of these products than the United States does. But I'm not completely sure which system is which. What I do know is that in our system, many of those products fall into a statutory legal regulatory framework that does not require data and pre-approval, but really tracks instead adverse consequences and also has some regulatory oversight of good manufacturing practice of these products. So that, I think that the most important way to address the important issue that you raise is really to develop the scientific understandings, and that will then drive the approval and use decision making.
I'd love to have us answer more questions, but we're at the end of our hour. For ACRT, AFMR, APOR, the Clinical Research Forum, and SCTS, we want to thank our panelists. This has been a thrilling presentation, and we're really looking forward to the impact that you project. Thanks.